At exactly 2:14 on the morning of October 14, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Silas Vance stood on the bridge of the HMS Vandal, tasting salt and the metallic tang of an impending slaughter. The North Atlantic was not a sea that morning. It was a hungry, churning void of obsidian water and freezing spray that stripped the skin from a man's knuckles in seconds. Around him, the 42 merchant ships of Convoy SC-104 labored through the swells, their hulls groaning under the weight of thousands of tons of crude oil, industrial steel, and high-explosive shells destined for the ports of Liverpool. They were the lifeblood of a continent under siege. But in the middle of the Black Pit, that terrifying stretch of the mid-Atlantic where no Allied aircraft could reach, they were nothing more than slow-moving targets. Silas Vance was 38 years old, a man with eyes the color of galvanized steel and hands scarred by years of prying sunken machinery from the silt of the English Channel. Unlike the career officers who populated the Admiralty's high-ceilinged offices in London, Vance was a product of grease and high-pressure steam. Before the war, he had been a deep-sea salvage engineer, a man hired to solve the problems that naval architects said were impossible. He didn't see the HMS Vandal as a glorious vessel of the Royal Navy. He saw her for what she truly was, a 1917 VNW-class destroyer that had been pulled from the scrap heap as a desperate measure. She was thin-skinned, her rivets were weeping, and her boilers were temperamental beasts that screamed when pushed past 20 knots. To the other escort commanders, Vance was an outsider plumber in a uniform who lacked the refined tactical pedigree of a King's Regulations officer. The situation, however, was about to render pedigree irrelevant. The hydrophone operator, a 19-year-old from Leeds named Miller, whose face was pale under the dim red battle lamps, suddenly pressed his headsets closer to his ears. The rhythmic, haunting ping of the Aztec surged through the bridge, but it was being drowned out by something much more terrifying. It wasn't just the high-pitched whine of a U-boat's electric motors. It was a deep, guttural thrum that vibrated through the Vandal's very deckplates. It was the sound of massive displacement, of heavy propellers churning the deep. 5 miles to the northeast, emerging from the freezing mist like a prehistoric predator, was the German heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper. She was a mountain of Krupp steel, bristling with 8-inch guns that could erase a destroyer like the Vandal from the surface of the earth before Vance could even see the flash of her muzzles. And she wasn't alone. Spread out in a lethal crescent behind her were 5 Type 7 U-boats, a wolfpack that had been stalking the convoy for 3 days, waiting for the moment when the moon dipped behind the clouds and the escort's fatigue reached its breaking point. On the bridge of the HMS Broadsword, the lead escort and the convoy's command ship, Commander Arbuthnot, stared at his radar screen in paralyzed silence. The math was simple, and it was devastating. The Hipper outranged them by 10 miles. Her armor was thick enough to ignore anything the escorts could throw at her, and her speed would allow her to pick off the merchant ships one by one. According to the rigid naval doctrine of the era, there was only one logical response to such an overwhelming force. If you stayed to fight, you died. If you stayed to fight, the convoy died anyway. The manual dictated a scatter order. Each ship would turn away from the others, fleeing in different directions in the hope that the enemy would only be able to chase down a fraction of the fleet. Signal from the broadsword, sir. The radio rating called out, his voice trembling. It's the scatter order, flash code Alpha 9. They're abandoning the formation. Vance looked out through the salt-crusted windows of the bridge. He saw the merchantman ships filled with civilian sailors, many of whom had already been torpedoed twice since 1939, beginning to veer away from one another. They were panicking. They were becoming isolated dots on a dark ocean, easy meat for the U-boats. To Vance, the scatter order wasn't a strategic withdrawal. It was a death sentence signed in ink by men who were too afraid to break the rules. If you like stories about the unsung heroes of the North Atlantic who stared down the giants of the German Navy, please hit that like button. It helps us keep these forgotten chronicles of bravery alive. Vance didn't look at his executive officer. He didn't look at the signal lamp of the broadsword as it flickered one last time, demanding acknowledgement. Instead, he walked over to the ship's internal telegraph. He reached for the heavy brass handle, his fingers lingering on the cold metal. He knew that what he was about to do would lead to a court-martial if he survived, and a watery grave if he didn't. "Sir," the helmsman whispered, sensing the shift in the room's atmosphere. "The broadsword is turning away. We have our orders." "The broadsword is following the manual," Vance said, his voice low and rasping like sandpaper on iron. "The manual was written by men who have never had to weld a whole plate shut while it was underwater. We are not scattering." Vance gripped the telegraph and slammed it to full ahead. Then, with a deliberate slow motion, he reached up and clicked the power toggle on the bridge's radio receiver to the off position. He didn't just ignore the order. He severed his connection to the world of sanctioned retreats. Mr. Miller Vance called out to the hydrophone operator. "Give me a bearing on the Hipper." 025, sir. She's accelerating. She's opening her main batteries." The first salvo from the German cruiser didn't hit the Vandal. It hit the SS Empire Rose, a cargo ship positioned half a mile to their port side. The explosion was so violent that it didn't just sink the ship, it disintegrated it. A pillar of orange flame roared 300 feet into the night sky, illuminating the entire horizon for a terrifying 5 seconds. In that flash of light, Vance saw the Hipper. She was a sleek, grey ghost, her turrets already rotating toward the next target. The men on the bridge of the Vandal were frozen. They were watching the end of their lives unfold in slow motion. The sheer scale of the German cruiser made their own ship feel like a tin toy. The Vandal's 4-inch guns were laughable in comparison. They might as well have been throwing pebbles at a tank. "Chief engineer to the bridge," Vance commanded into the voice pipe. A moment later, Chief Miller, a man who had spent 30 years in the bowels of various engine rooms and whose skin seemed to be permanently stained with bunker oil, clambered up the ladder. He looked at the fire on the horizon, then at Vance. He didn't need to be told how bad the situation was. He could feel it in the way the ship was vibrating. "Chief," Vance said, leaning in close so the rest of the bridge crew wouldn't hear, "I need you to forget everything they taught you at the academy. I don't want efficiency. I don't want safety margins. I want you to go down there and bypass the pressure release valves on the primary boilers." The chief's eyes widened. "Sir, those valves are the only thing keeping the deck from blowing into orbit. If we bypass them, the internal pressure will exceed the structural integrity of the casing." "I know," Vance replied. "But I also want you to do something else. I want you to reroute the high-pressure exhaust. I want it dumped directly into the external cooling vents, right at the waterline." The chief stared at him, his mind racing through the physics. The thermal shock, the steam would be massive. It would create a cloud, but it would also scream. The acoustic distortion would be deafening to any sonar in the water. "Exactly," Vance said. "We're not going to outgun them, Chief. We're going to confuse them. I want this ship to sound like a ghost and look like a nightmare. Now go. We have about 12 minutes before that cruiser realizes we're the only ones not running away." As the chief disappeared back into the depths of the ship, Vance turned to the helmsman. "Hard a starboard. Bring us about. We're heading straight for the Hipper's center of mass." The Vandal groaned as she leaned into the turn. Behind them, the rest of the escort ships were disappearing into the gloom, following the correct procedure. They were leaving the merchant ships to their fate. But the Vandal, a battered, outdated relic, commanded by a man who saw the world in terms of pressure and torque rather than rank and file, was charging into the heart of the storm. Vance stood at the forward window, his eyes locked on the horizon where the next German salvo was about to erupt. He wasn't a hero in his own mind. He was a mechanic, and he had realized that if you can't fix a machine, you break it in a way that serves your purpose. The Vandal was about to be broken, but she would go down screaming a lie that would save 4,000 men. The air on the bridge grew colder as they picked up speed, the old destroyer's hull plates beginning to shiver with a violent, rhythmic percussion. Every bolt in the ship seemed to be protesting the speed Vance was demanding. To the German gunners on the Hipper, the Vandal must have looked like a suicide, craft a tiny, insignificant speck rushing toward its doom. But Silas Vance wasn't planning on dying quietly. He was planning on rewriting the laws of naval warfare, using nothing but steam, oil, and the sheer audacity of a man who refused to follow a suicidal rulebook. The first of the forbidden modifications was about to be engaged, and the North Atlantic was about to witness a haunting that no radar operator would ever be able to explain. The temperature in the boiler room of the HMS Vandal had climbed to a staggering 140 degrees Fahrenheit, a blistering contrast to the sub-zero gale howling just inches away on the other side of the steel hull. Down here, in the vibrating, oil-slicked bowels of the ship, the air was thick with the smell of scorched paint and atomized fuel. Chief Miller and his team of stokers were no longer just operating a ship. They were performing surgery on a dying beast while it was still running at full throttle. They had bypassed the safety governors on the Yarrow boilers, allowing the internal pressure to climb toward 500 pounds per square inch a level that turned the ancient copper piping into a network of potential pipe bombs. Every time the Vandal took a heavy swell, the entire compartment groaned, the rivets straining against the impossible torque. Above them, on the bridge, Silas Vance felt every shudder. To a career naval officer, these vibrations would have been a warning of imminent mechanical failure. To Vance, they were a language. He knew exactly which bearing was overheating and which hull plate was weeping salt water. But his focus was split between the mechanical agony of his ship and the tactical nightmare unfolding on the horizon. The Admiral Hipper had found its range. A 4-gun salvo from the German cruiser erupted 200 yards off the Vandal's starboard bow, sending a wall of freezing Atlantic water crashing over the bridge. The impact was so violent, it felt like a physical blow from a giant's fist. The ship listed heavily, the compass swinging wildly as the helmsman fought to keep her head into the wind. Range to the Hipper, Vance shouted over the roar of the wind. 7,000 yards, and closing, sir. Miller yelled back from the hydrophone station. They've shifted fire from the merchantman. They're looking for us now. Vance knew the German commander's mindset. To the Germans, the Vandal was a nuisance, a lone, suicidal escort that hadn't received the memo to run. But Vance was counting on the very thing that made the Royal Navy so rigid, the German reliance on their superior technology. The Hipper was equipped with the Fumo 27 radar, a sophisticated piece of kit that allowed them to see through the mist and spray. It gave them an almost godlike perspective on the battlefield. But radar, as Vance knew from his years spent analyzing sonar echoes in the deep-sea salvage trade, was not an infallible eye. It was an interpretation of reflected energy. And energy could be lied to. In the silence of his own mind, Vance felt a cold, sharp clarity. He wasn't thinking about king and country, and he wasn't thinking about the medals he would never receive. He was thinking about a salvage job he'd done in 1934 off the coast of Cornwall, where he'd used a series of air-filled bladders and scrap metal to trick the tide into lifting a sunken freighter. He realized that the Atlantic didn't care about the caliber of your guns. It only cared about how you manipulated its physics. The Admiralty's scatter order was based on the assumption that the enemy was an unstoppable force. Vance's entire life had taught him that there was no such thing as an unstoppable force, only forces that hadn't been given a reason to hesitate. Chief Vance barked into the voice pipe, his voice cutting through the mechanical chaos. Open the bypass valves, now. Below decks, Miller gripped a massive iron wheel that was almost too hot to touch, even through his heavy leather gloves. With a grunt of pure exertion, he heaved it over. The result was instantaneous and terrifying. The high-pressure steam, which should have been driving the turbines, was suddenly vented directly into the external cooling channels. These channels were designed to take in cold seawater to condense exhaust. Instead, they were suddenly filled with superheated, pressurized vapor. The Vandal didn't just speed up, she seemed to scream. A massive, deafening hiss erupted from the waterline, a sound so loud it drowned out the crashing of the waves. At the same time, the external vents, never meant to handle such thermal stress, began to glow a dull, angry red. The interaction between the 500-degree steam and the 34-degree Atlantic water created a localized weather event. A thick, roiling plume of white fog began to pour out of the ship's sides, blanketing the Vandal in a self-generated cloud that smelled of sulfur and scalded salt. But that was only the first part of the deception. "Drop the draglines," Vance ordered. Two crews of sailors on the aft deck, working in the blinding spray and darkness, released the locking pins on two massive lengths of heavy anchor chain. These weren't being used to moor the ship. They were being dragged behind the Vandal like the tails of a kite. Each link of the chain weighed over 50 pounds. As they hit the water at 25 knots, they didn't just sink. They skipped and churned, creating a massive, turbulent wake that stretched for hundreds of yards behind the destroyer. To any observer on the surface, it looked like a frantic, failing ship. But to the radar operators on the Admiral Hipper, the world had suddenly changed. If you're finding this account of unconventional naval warfare gripping, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. We dive deep into the technical secrets that changed the course of history, stories the textbooks often overlook. On the bridge of the German cruiser, the mood shifted from predatory confidence to sudden, sharp confusion. The radar officer, a seasoned veteran named Oberleutnant Kraus, stared at his glowing green screen. Seconds ago, the target had been a single, small, blipper-clear signature of a V-class destroyer. Now the signal was blooming. The massive thermal plume from the steam bypass was reflecting the radar pulses with unexpected intensity, creating a target that appeared 10 times larger than it actually was. Furthermore, the turbulent wake created by the dragging anchor chains was scattering the radar waves in a chaotic pattern, mimicking the displacement of a much heavier vessel. On Kraus's screen, the Vandal had vanished. In its place was a massive, blurry signature that looked like a Queen Elizabeth-class battleship emerging from the mist. Captain Kraus called out, his voice tight with alarm. "The contact, it's changing. The signal strength has increased by 800%. It's not a destroyer, it's a capital ship. She must have been running under radar silence in the squall." The German commander, Captain Zur, C. Wilhelm Meisel, stepped over to the radar station. He looked at the blooming ghost on the screen. He knew the British had several task forces in the area, but the intelligence reports had placed them hundreds of miles to the south. However, he couldn't ignore the evidence of his own eyes or his own ears. The hydrophone operator was now reporting a massive, low-frequency thrumming. The anchor chains dragging through the water were creating a rhythmic, heavy vibration that perfectly mimicked the signature of large-bore turbine engines. Meisel hesitated. This was the moment Vance had been betting his life on. In the naval manual of the Kriegsmarine, a heavy cruiser like the Hipper was a formidable weapon. But she was no match for a British battleship in a close-quarters night engagement. If a battleship was indeed emerging from the fog at point-blank range, the Hipper was in grave danger of being rammed or obliterated by 15-inch shells. "Cease fire on the merchantman," Meisel ordered. "All batteries shift to the new contact. Defensive maneuvers. Turn to port, 30 degrees. We cannot let them cross our T." On the bridge of the Vandal, Vance saw the Hipper's massive silhouette begin to bank away. The German giant was flinching. The plumber's hack was working. But the cost was becoming apparent. The Vandal's hull was vibrating so violently that the light bulbs in the bridge were shattering one by one, showering the crew in glass. The steam bypass was cooking the ship from the inside out. In the engine room, the heat had reached 160 degrees. Men were collapsing, their lungs burning from the humid, pressurized air. Vance gripped the railing, his knuckles white. He could feel the ship dying beneath him. The hull plates near the cooling vents were warping, the steel groaning as it was subjected to forces it was never meant to survive. He looked back toward the convoy. Because the Hipper had turned to engage the Ghost, the merchant ships had gained a crucial 3 miles of distance. They were disappearing into a heavy rain squall to the west, the very squall that would hide them for the rest of the night. But the Vandal was now alone in the center of the German formation. The U-boats, confused by the shifting radar signatures and the massive acoustic distortion in the water, were beginning to converge on the Vandal's position. They thought they were hunting a battleship. "Sir, the boilers are redlining," the voice pipe sputtered. It was Miller, his voice sounding thin and exhausted. "The casing is starting to crack. If we don't vent the pressure in the next 5 minutes, the Vandal is going to turn into a cloud of scrap metal." Vance looked at the Hipper, which was now broadside to them, its massive guns searching the mist for a battleship that didn't exist. He knew he couldn't keep the lie going much longer. The physics were reaching their breaking point. "Hold it for 3 more minutes, Chief," Vance whispered into the pipe. "Just 3 more minutes. We have to make them believe the ghost is real." He stood there, a lone man on a broken ship, watching the horizon. He had successfully tricked a Titan. But now the Titan was starting to realize that the phantom it was fighting didn't have any teeth. The first German star shells shot into the sky, bursting over the Vandal and illuminating the roiling white fog of her own making. The moment of truth had arrived. The Germans were about to see exactly what had been haunting them. At exactly 2:41 in the morning, the magnesium flare, ignited by the Admiral Hipper's star shell, reached its peak altitude of 2,000 feet, bathing the black Atlantic in a cruel, artificial noon. For 30 seconds, the deception was stripped bare. Lieutenant Commander Silas Vance stood on the bridge of the HMS Vandal, his eyes squinting against the blinding white glare, watching as the roiling wall of steam he had created was illuminated from above. To the Germans, the massive radar return still looked like a battleship, but the visual evidence was starting to contradict the electronic data. Through their high-powered Zeiss optics, the German observers could see the silhouette of a small, battered destroyer, David pretending to be a Goliath. The Vandal was now operating at 28 knots, nearly 4 knots over its rated maximum speed. In the engine room, the vibrations had reached a frequency that was no longer a sound, but a physical sickness. Every man in the engineering space was vomiting from the combination of extreme heat, the smell of vaporized grease, and the sheer rhythmic violence of the overstressed turbines. Chief Miller was standing knee-deep in a mixture of seawater and oil, his hands wrapped in rags as he manually adjusted the tension on the bypass valves. One of the main steam lines had developed a hairline fracture, and a jet of superheated vapor was slicing through the air like a localized laser, cutting through a wooden toolkit as if it were butter. "The aft dragline has snapped, sir," the bosun yelled over the roar of the wind. "The starboard chain is gone. We've lost the acoustic signature." Vance felt the shift immediately. The rhythmic thrumming that had been mimicking a battleship's heavy screws suddenly turned into a high-pitched, frantic whine. The ghost was losing its voice. On the radar screens of the Admiral Hipper, the massive blip began to flicker and shrink. The German commander, Captain Meisel, was no fool. He had spent the last 10 minutes maneuvering for a classic naval engagement against a superior foe, but the lack of return fire was finally beginning to register. A British battleship would have opened up with 15-inch guns long ago. The silence from the ghost was the one variable Vance couldn't fix. "They're turning back, sir," the helmsman whispered, his voice cracking. "The Hipper, she's coming about. She's bringing her forward turrets to bear on us." Vance didn't answer immediately. He was looking at the convoy. The merchant ships were nearly gone, swallowed by the thick rain squall 3 miles to the west. They were safe, provided the Hipper didn't realize the trick in the next 5 minutes. But the Vandal was now a sitting duck in the center of a magnesium-lit stage. 2 German U-boats, U-453 and U-211, had surfaced less than 1,000 yards away, their commanders confused by the chaotic signals but sensing the kill. They were positioning for a pincer attack, their deck guns already manned. In the silence of his own mind, Silas Vance felt a strange, detached sense of peace. He thought about the salvage yards of his youth, the smell of rusted iron, and the way a ship looked when it was stripped of its dignity and reduced to its component parts. He realized that he had never been a warrior in the traditional sense. He was a man who understood the limits of materials. He knew that everything steel, men, and even fear had a yield point. The Vandal had reached hers. He could feel the hull plates beneath his boots rippling like parchment. The ship was literally tearing itself apart to maintain this speed. If you want to see the moment, Vance decided to turn his ship into a literal firebomb to save the last 3 merchantmen. Drop a like and tell us in the comments what you would have done in his shoes. The narrator's voice would say in a break. Every interaction helps us keep these stories of technical madness alive. "Sir, the U-boats are opening fire." The first shells from the surfaced submarines whistled over the bridge, splashing harmlessly into the sea. But the Admiral Hipper was now fully committed. The cruiser's secondary 5-inch batteries erupted in a rhythmic sequence of orange flashes. The Vandal was bracketed. Huge plumes of water geysered into the air, drenching the deck and shorting out the remaining exterior lights. "Chief," Vance screamed into the voice pipe, "the oil. Dump the pressurized bunker oil into the exhaust vents. All of it. Sir, if the oil hits those red-hot vents, the whole ship will go up." Miller's voice was barely audible over the mechanical screaming of the boilers. "Do it, Miller. That's an order. We need a fire slick." Vance was gambling on a phenomenon he had seen once during a refinery fire in Southampton. If you pressurized heavy fuel oil and sprayed it into a high-temperature steam environment, it didn't just burn, it atomized. Below decks, the engineers opened the final set of valves. Thousands of gallons of thick, black bunker oil were pumped directly into the superheated steam bypass. The result was a spectacle of biblical proportions. A massive, roiling cloud of black, oily smoke erupted from the Vandal's sides, but it was laced with streaks of brilliant, incandescent orange. The oil didn't fully ignite because of the lack of oxygen in the steam, but it created a radaropic cloud. To the German radar operators, it looked like the target had just suffered a catastrophic internal explosion. The signal on their screens didn't just grow, it shattered into 1,000 jagged fragments. At the same time, Vance ordered the helmsman to cut the engines and throw the rudder hard to port. The Vandal, losing its forward momentum, skidded into the center of its own black, oily cloud. To the Germans, watching from the Hipper, it appeared as though the British battleship had been hit, blown up, and was now sinking in a massive pool of burning oil. Captain Meisel on the Hipper lowered his binoculars. "Target destroyed," he muttered, watching the massive black cloud on the horizon. "A lucky hit on their magazines. The ship is gone." But inside that cloud, the Vandal was far from gone. She was silent, drifting in a sea of her own waste, her engines stilled to prevent any further acoustic signature. The heat in the engine room was now so intense that the paint on the bulkheads was bubbling and peeling off in long scorched strips. Men were lying on the floor, breathing through wet rags, their skin blistered. They were trapped in a steel coffin of their own making, surrounded by the enemy. Vance stood on the bridge, his hand on the cold steel of the railing. He could hear the Hipper's engines fading into the distance. The cruiser was moving back toward its original course. Satisfied with its kill, the U-boats too were diving, their commanders eager to report the sinking of a capital ship to the High Command in Berlin. "Don't move," Vance whispered to his crew. "Don't even drop a wrench. We are a ghost now." For the next 20 minutes, the Vandal sat motionless in the dark. The only sound was the clicking of cooling metal and the gentle lap of the Atlantic against the warped hull. Vance looked at his watch. 3:04 a.m. The convoy would be 10 miles away by now, safely tucked into the heart of the storm. He had bought them 30 minutes of life by sacrificing his ship's dignity and nearly its existence. But as the fog began to clear, a new sound emerged. It wasn't the heavy thrum of a cruiser or the whine of a U-boat. It was the sharp, metallic ping of an active sonar sweep. And it wasn't coming from the Germans. A new set of lights appeared on the southern horizon. Not the orange of German shells or the white of magnesium flares, but the steady, rhythmic blinking of a British signal lamp. The HMS Broadsword, the command ship that had ordered the scatter, had turned back. They had seen the explosion. They had seen the battleship on their own radar, and they were coming to investigate the wreckage. "Signal from Broadsword, sir," the rating whispered, his voice trembling with a mix of relief and terror. "They're asking for our identity. They think we're the remains of a German strike." Vance looked at his shattered bridge, his exhausted crew, and the oily slick that covered his once grey ship. He knew that the moment he answered that signal, the reality of his insubordination would catch up with him. He had ignored a direct order. He had nearly destroyed a king's ship through unauthorized modifications. And he had lied to everyone on the ocean. "Tell them," Vance said, his voice cracking. "Tell them this is the HMS Vandal. And tell them to bring some damn fire extinguishers. We're a bit warm over here." As the signal lamp began to flicker its response, Vance felt the weight of the night finally beginning to crush him. He had won the battle of physics, but the battle of bureaucracy was only just beginning. He didn't know then that the Admiralty would try to bury the events of this night, or that his plumber's hack would be studied in secret by naval engineers for decades to come. He only knew that the merchant ships were safe, and that his boilers hadn't exploded it. The Vandal began to limp forward, her engines coughing and sputtering as Chief Miller managed to restore a trickle of power. They were moving at barely 5 knots, held together by literal baling wire and the sheer stubbornness of a man who refused to believe in suicidal math. The giant had been fooled, the prize had vanished, and the rules of war had been broken by a man with a wrench and a dream of survival. At exactly 8:42 on the morning of October 15, 1942, the sun began to bleed through the heavy Atlantic overcast, revealing a scene that looked more like a graveyard than a naval victory. The HMS Broadsword, its brasswork gleaming and its crew in pristine battle dress, slowed to a crawl as it approached the drifting remains of the HMS Vandal. Commander Arbuthnot stood on his bridge, his binoculars trembling slightly. He had expected to find a debris field, or perhaps a few oil-soaked survivors in life rafts. Instead, he found a ship that defied every law of naval maintenance. The Vandal was a blackened, twisted skeleton. Her hull was scorched from the waterline to the funnels. Her deck plates were buckled upward, like the lid of a tin can, and she was listing 7 degrees to port. She wasn't just damaged. She looked like she had been dragged through the fires of hell and spat back out. Silas Vance was still on his bridge, though bridge was now a generous term for the jagged cage of steel that remained. He was covered in a fine layer of soot and dried salt, his hands raw and bleeding where the heat of the telegraph had melted his skin. He didn't offer a salute when the broadsword pulled alongside. He didn't even look up. He was watching the horizon, where the last of the 42 merchant ships had long since vanished into the safety of the western squall. He had stayed behind to ensure the ghost remained alive until the very last moment, and now the silence of the ocean was his only reward. Commander Vance Arbuthnot's voice boomed across the water via a megaphone, sounding strangely hollow in the vastness of the sea. "We are sending over a boarding party and medical teams. You ignored a direct signal to scatter. You have endangered your crew and your vessel. Explain yourself." Vance slowly turned his head. His eyes were bloodshot, his face a mask of exhaustion. He looked at the Broadsword, a ship that had followed the rules, and, in doing so, had nearly consigned 4,000 merchant sailors to the deep. "The convoy is safe, Commander," Vance replied, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "The boilers are dead. The hull is compromised. If you want an explanation, send me a mechanic, not a boarding party." The aftermath was swift and cold. While the merchant sailors of Convoy SC-104 were reaching the docks of Liverpool, toasted as heroes who had survived the Black Pit, Silas Vance was being escorted into a wood-panelled room in the Admiralty's basement in London. It was November 3, 1942. The room was filled with the smell of old paper and the judgmental silence of men who had spent the war, looking at maps rather than machinery. 3 admirals sat behind a long oak table, their chests heavy with ribbons, their eyes fixed on the man who had dared to turn off his radio. The court of inquiry was not interested in the lives saved. They were interested in the procedure. To the Admiralty, the scatter order was a sacred tenet designed to preserve the escort fleet. By ignoring it, Vance had challenged the very foundation of naval discipline. They spent 4 hours grilling him on the technical details of his forbidden modification. They called it reckless. They called it a plumber's fantasy. They produced a report from a naval architect, stating that the thermal bypass maneuver should have resulted in an immediate catastrophic explosion, killing everyone on board. You risked a king's ship on a gamble that violates the laws of thermodynamics. "Commander," the lead admiral said, tapping a silver pen against the table. "You created a fraudulent signature that could have drawn the entire German Navy onto your position. If the Admiral Hipper had called your bluff 5 minutes earlier, you would have been blown out of the water, and the convoy would have been slaughtered." Vance stood there, his back straight, despite the lingering ache in his lungs from the steam. He didn't offer a dramatic defense. He didn't speak of bravery. He spoke of torque, pressure, and the refractive index of superheated vapor. The German commander didn't call my bluff because he trusted his equipment more than his instincts, Vance said. The Hipper is a masterpiece of engineering, but it is operated by men who believe that if their radar sees a battleship, then a battleship must exist. I didn't fight their guns. I fought their sensors. And as for the risk to the Vandal, she was already a scrap heap. I just gave her one last chance to be useful. The verdict was a masterpiece of bureaucratic cowardice. The Admiralty couldn't court-martial him. The merchant navy unions had already leaked the story to the press, and Vance was being hailed as the ghost of the Atlantic in the London papers. To punish him would be a public relations disaster, but they couldn't reward him either. To give Silas Vance a Victoria Cross would be an admission that the Admiralty's own doctrine was flawed. Instead, they gave him a quiet retirement. Silas Vance was stripped of his command for medical reasons and transferred to a desk job in a salvage yard in Scotland, far from the front lines and far from any ship he could potentially overclock again. The HMS Vandal never sailed again. She was towed to a breaker's yard in 1943, her hull so warped by the thermal stress that she was deemed structurally unsound for even the simplest patrol duties. She was sold for scrap, her steel melted down to build newer, more regulated ships. If this story of a man who broke every rule to save thousands has moved you, please hit that like button. Every single like tells the world that these forgotten stories of ingenuity and defiance matter. Don't let the names of men like Silas Vance disappear into the fog of history. Decades passed. Silas Vance died in 1968, a quiet man who spent his final years repairing fishing boat engines in a small coastal village. He never wrote a memoir. He never gave interviews. To his neighbors, he was just a retired engineer who knew an unusual amount about high-pressure steam. But the story didn't end in the scrapyard. In 1984, the West German government declassified the logs of the Admiral Hipper. Within those pages, historians found the account of the engagement with convoy SC-104. Captain Mizell had written extensively about the British battleship that had emerged from the mist. He described a vessel of massive displacement and overwhelming acoustic power that had forced him to abort his attack. He had been so convinced he was facing a capital ship that he had reported the sinking of a Queen Elizabeth-class battleship to Berlin, a claim that had caused a temporary panic in the German High Command. Modern naval analysts who studied the Vandal's logs alongside the German reports realized that Vance hadn't just gotten lucky. He had pioneered the concept of signature management and acoustic deception, the very foundation of modern stealth technology. The plumber's hack was, in reality, the first recorded instance of intentional electronic warfare on the high seas. Vance had understood, 40 years before the rest of the world, that in the age of technology, the battle is won not by the man with the biggest gun, but by the man who controls what the enemy thinks they see. Today, there is no monument to the HMS Vandal. There is no plaque in the Admiralty for Silas Vance. But if you visit the small village where he spent his final days, you might find an old, rusted anchor chain sitting in the harbor, used now to moor simple rowboats. It is a heavy, weathered thing, identical to the ones Vance dragged through the Atlantic to create a ghost. The legacy of the Vandal lives on every time a modern commander uses a decoy to distract a missile, or a pilot uses chaff to hide from a radar. It is a reminder that when the machines of war are at their most lethal and the rules of engagement are at their most rigid, the only thing that can tip the scales is the desperate, unscripted creativity of a human mind. Silas Vance didn't just save a convoy. He proved that no matter how much steel you have, or how many guns you carry, you can still be defeated by a man with a wrench and the courage to ignore a suicidal order. As you go about your day, remember the ghost of the Atlantic. Remember that sometimes the only way to win is to break every rule and trust in the physics of the impossible. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from, whether you're in the United States, the UK, or anywhere else. Your presence here keeps these memories alive. You're not just a viewer. You're the guardian of a history that almost vanished. Until next time, stay curious, and stay defiant.